So In Time is a thing. That science fiction movie with Justin Timberlake and Amanda Seyfried from the early 2010s? Yeah, I would not be surprised if you'd forgotten about this one. It wasn't anything particularly special. It was in that thread of action movies that cropped up after The Matrix, where they all had this strange desire to have philosophical underpinnings justify their gratuitous explosions and unnecessary fight scenes. But they could never quite get it right, could they? And they all had the same super glossy and slick camera filter on all the time. Movies like Equilibrium, The Island, and ironically The Matrix sequels. Well, In Time fits in neatly with those movies. The biggest difference is that this movie happens to be one of those rare films where they came up with an idea and unintentionally wound up making something that is actually ridiculously clever. Like how if you choose to read The Adjustment Bureau with Emily Blunt's character as the main character, you realize that the film could be seen as an allegory for how patriarchal societies and organizations have traditionally and continually sought to control the lives of women. Like, you know that's not what the movie's about, but it's there and it's kind of accidentally brilliant. In Time is kind of like that. The writers clearly knew they had a neat idea, but the execution is just really not that well thought out, which was a waste of both the idea and the on-screen talent. I first saw this movie all the way back in the summer of 2016. A coworker suggested that after work we should relax and watch an action movie, so we did just that, and on a hot summer night it was a great way to unwind with a few friends. But unlike a lot of the other science fiction and action movies of this type, this one really stuck with me. I mean, clearly I'm obviously ramping up to something. Behind all of the dumb chase scenes and over-the-top car set pieces, bizarre gunfights, weird camera filter, and the waste of Cillian Murphy, Olivia Wilde, and Amanda Seyfried, there was that premise. And occasionally, when the movie could get out of its own way, it even explored that premise in some pretty interesting ways. Unfortunately, this is not really the focus of the movie, but the premise is there if you're willing to look for it, and of course I'm going to point out where it works. This movie is actually a really fascinating exploration and reflection of how we use currency and value our time in society, about the value of a human life and how exploitable time really is. And there are really good examples to back all of this up right there in the movie. You just have to look past the unbelievable characters making unrealistic decisions. If you can do that, then this movie has some fantastic insight. And so today, I want to talk about In Time. Writer and director Andrew Niccol had come up with a script for a new film and was looking to make and direct it. Fox was excited about the project as Niccol was famous for writing and directing the science fiction classic Gattaca, directing the existential masterpiece The Truman Show, and for the not quite so amazing but no less intriguing Simone. With a pedigree like that, the studio decided that his new movie could be a big budget action movie and warranted a big budget cast. Two big-name stars in Justin Timberlake and Amanda Seyfried were cast as the leads, with an up-and-coming Cillian Murphy cast opposite them. Johnny Galecki and Olivia Wilde, who were both hot off their television recognition, filled in the supporting cast. The film was envisioned with this kind of retro-future aesthetic as a spiritual callback to Gattaca, so the cars, clothes, and look of the movie all have this vaguely 1950s aesthetic while still being firmly rooted in science fiction. Filming took place in and around Los Angeles to reflect the setting of the movie and to convey the socioeconomic differences in the narrative through the locations in their real-world counterparts. The film was released in fall of 2011 and was by no means a hit, but it did manage to perform decently at the box office. Even back then, critics were hard on the movie's story and acting, but praised the premise and drew favorable comparisons to the works of Harlan Ellison and the short film The Price of Life. I feel like most of the criticism was probably aimed at the emphasis on action and the downright absence of character development or even motivation, really. And while the premise is explored a bit, I feel as though a more thorough examination of the world and the mechanics of its time-based currency would have been beneficial. So if any executives want to give me a crack at making this into a TV show, call me. Wait, Fox is owned by Disney now. Never mind. If you haven't seen this movie, or more likely don't remember it, that's fine. I'm going to do a summary anyway, but on the off chance you want to rewatch it on your own, here's your spoiler warning. The year is 2169. Ha! That's the sex number. Will Salas lives in the slums of Los Angeles with his mother, Rachel.
Happy 50th.
50. That's right.
25 for the 25th time.
Like a lot of people even in today's time, they live paycheck to paycheck, but there's a difference in that everyone has a clock counting down the time they have left, like that one Nickelback music video. See, everyone in this future stops aging once they turn 25. Instead of growing old, your time is used as currency. If you have enough time, you never have to worry about anything and you can take life slowly as it comes, and you can use your excess time to purchase luxury goods. But most people live day to day with just a handful of hours on their clock until they hit that next paycheck, or time check, or whatever. But some people have so much money, they can basically live forever. After working a shift, Will meets a man with over a century on his clock, which catches the attention of the Minutemen, or mobsters who steal time instead of money. On a whim, Will helps this man escape. The man, named Henry Hamilton, explains that he's from New Greenwich, a different sector of the city where the super wealthy live. Hamilton has lived for so long he no longer wants to be alive, and gifts Will all of his time before letting himself time out. Will now has over 100 years on his clock, and for the first time, things are starting to look up as he can now pay off all his debts. Will waits for his mom at the bus stop so he can give her the good news, only to find that she is not on the bus. He figures something must have gone wrong and begins trying to find her. After paying off some of the loan, Rachel only had so much time left and couldn't afford the new bus fare.
It's a 2-hour walk. I have an hour and a half.
Then you better run.
Will finds his mother, but it's too late, and she times out in his arms. See, it's this kind of heartbreaking, almost Shakespearean tragedy that makes this movie almost amazing. Will has a century now, but he's too late to give any of it to his mom. It's scenes like this that could have made this movie excellent, but then it goes and pulls shit like what happens next. Will decides that he has nothing holding him to the slums and fucks off to New Greenwich, I guess because he can. Meanwhile, the death of the wealthy Henry Hamilton has caught the attention of Officer Raymond Leon of the Timekeepers, who can link Will to the scene, making him the prime suspect. And because Will traveled to New Greenwich, they're also able to track a large quantity of time he spent getting through the toll booths. On the ritzy side of the city, Will stays in nice hotels and eats nice food and decides he's going to play poker, except when time is the currency, his literal life is on the line. Luckily, Will is apparently amazing at poker and scores himself 11 million years and an invite to a swanky party by the owner of Weiss Time Lenders, Philip Weiss. At the party, Will meets Philip's daughter, Sylvia Weiss, and the two seem to have a kind of connection, but this is interrupted by the arrival of the Timekeepers, who detain Will and take most of his time as he is a murder suspect. But Will manages to escape because he's also apparently an amazing fighter. He takes Sylvia hostage and starts running like his name is Logan. And escapes back to the slums where he crashes his car and Sylvia has all of her time stolen as well. Will uses Sylvia as leverage to try and have 1,000 years wired to a charity in order to give back to the people, but Sylvia's father refuses. Out of options, Will lets Sylvia go, but she is upset that her father apparently couldn't even spare 1,000 years for his safety. And then she winds up shooting the timekeeper because she cares about Will now for some reason. Anyway, the two of them now go on a bank robbing spree and start giving back to the people while saving a little bit of time for themselves. Eventually, the Minutemen catch up with Will and Sylvia, and their leader challenges Will to a time fight, which Will wins because apparently he's also really good at that too. The pair realize that they can't keep running forever and that their petty theft and giving back to the people hasn't made a big enough difference. So they come up with what is probably the most contrived plan ever to steal 1,000,000 years from Philip, which they do, and for some reason this upsets the whole system, causing the stock market to stop working or something. I don't know how time economics work. Sylvia and Will then attempt to escape the timekeeper, but he catches them as their clocks are running down. But Raymond times out first. Will then runs to Raymond's car to get enough time and meets Sylvia just before her clock reaches 0, and the pair then decide to Bonnie and Clyde their way through every major time bank in the world. Time as currency is a neat concept, and despite this being science fiction, it's not the most unrealistic thing about this movie. The fact that Sylvia Weiss chooses to run in high heels when she's clearly running out of time is. But apart from that, time as currency seems like science fiction, but it's not that far off from our current economic system. Now, we don't pay people in time, but we do pay people for their time. And that means time has a commodified value that can be bought and sold. On the surface, this would seem like a non-issue. If people require resources to live and other people own resources, then the exchange of goods or labor can be used to acquire the resources needed to survive. We use currency as a way to exchange the value of services and resources more universally, so that I have the value of the service rendered to me, but I wasn't paid with like a goat because, what am I going to do with a goat? Don't get me wrong, goats are great, but what if I live in a city? Instead, currency lets me have the value of the goat without all the bleeding and the pooping and whatnot. This is great and makes the exchange of goods seem more reasonable. The problem is that when currency was taken up, we didn't do away with bartering over the price of things. As such, people want to buy things for less and work for more. We want to get the best deal for the least amount of money. And when we're talking about goods, I don't have a problem with this. But when we start talking about people and labor, this gets a bit tricky. In the movie, we see the exchange of time as a currency for labor, and it's pretty straightforward. It's the same as it would be with any other currency, but it means that people are literally spending their time in order to get time back. Getting work done requires time be spent at a task. For Will, this is at the factory making things. The time he spends there, however many hours, are hopefully going to yield more than the time he put in. Otherwise, he's at a deficit.
Another one.
broad daylight.
This is pretty evident in the movies, so we can assume for the purposes of argument that people are getting paid in more time than they spend on the labor itself.
Hey Ray, I'll give you 10 minutes for an hour.
Yeah, try and figure that interaction out. So people will always try to overinflate the value of their time because it has to be worth more than the time they put in. Straightforward. But we haven't talked about what that time means in terms of the overall value of your life and what happens when someone can get paid more or are seen as more valuable. What was a simple exchange of time or currency now becomes a problem of the value of time from one person to another. When people work, whether in the movie or in the real world, their time is given a value. And if you're educated or have a desirable skill, then your time is considered more valuable, so you get paid more. In time's use of time itself as currency brings an inherent inequality to the forefront because it changes the value of labor from an economic question to an ethical one. When you get down to it, the only resource we really have is time. Time in the real world is already a kind of capital in that we can invest it and hopefully reap the rewards when it's exchanged. In order to make money, you need to spend time, or be born into a wealthy family. In order to create a resource or even learn skills at school, you have to invest time. But, as the movie likes to remind us so much,
I don't have time.
If time can be commodified, and the value of my time is worth more than another person's time, then we can literally buy a chunk of a person's life as a shift or a certain amount of time where they do labor for someone else. And if they're not as educated or skilled, then their time is worth less, meaning a part of their life, or all of their life potentially, is worth less. Not everyone gets paid on the value of their skill though. Will works a shift job in a factory producing a product. For this, he is paid based on how many units he produces. That's good incentive, but it means that the value of Will's time is reduced to how many units he can produce within a given time. So now his time is based on his speed and not his skill, which means that in this kind of shift work or in the value of skilled labor work, your time is still valued differently from other people, and therefore different people's lives would be worth different amounts. And if you think this only happens in the movie, then I'm afraid to disappoint you. While the use of time as an exchangeable currency is fiction, the way we value people's time and therefore their lives is not. The movie's use of time does an excellent job of revealing how currency obfuscates the truth about how some people's time and therefore their lives are worth less than others. Okay, but we don't actually value people's whole lives, just their skilled labor and the time they put in. People with more skill or abilities should be paid more. Aside from this hyperbolic argument I've put out, we never compare the value or put a monetary value on a person's life.
Oh, but we do.
The value of labor is a fair response, and I don't really see another way around that in our current economic system, but we do in fact enumerate specific monetary values for the cost of an entire life. A VSL, or the value of a statistical life, is an actual term that is used in risk management. It's designed to create a cost analysis of an injury or death in the event something were to happen to an individual. It is the estimated amount of money that would be paid if a family member were to die. There's this fancy equation for how they come up with the answer. Don't ask me how it works though, I went to school for music and philosophy, not actuarial science. And that's why my time is less valuable. While this may only be used in risk management and is meant to factor in the cost of injury or death for corporations to consider when completing a task or transaction, it does mean that to some extent we are okay with monetary compensation. That a human being's life can be measured or exchanged for money. I understand that I'm drawing extreme conclusions and being a bit of an alarmist for the sake of the video. Not that it isn't a little bit alarming, but there are in fact some people out there who don't agree with the way we've commodified a life or the way we value people's time. Elizabeth Anderson is one of these people, and she's been writing about these problems for a while now. She thinks that because a VSL is calculated by a region or a country against its own economics, the outcome of that formula is valued against the cost of living in that area, meaning a person in a wealthier region has a higher payout from a VSL than in a poorer area. Like how Henry Hamilton's death mattered more to the timekeepers because he was from New Greenwich, despite people in Dayton dropping like flies.
Why are you investigating a suicide? There's mass murder in the ghetto every day.
To Anderson, this is unfair, and because demographics and geography are inextricably linked, it's probably more than a little bit racist. But she also thinks there's another inherent problem in putting monetary value on a human life. For her and many others, it's not just unfair, but unethical to put a price on life. Anderson falls back on the ethics of Emanuel Kant.
Kant.
Kant thinks that everything under the sun can be bought and sold for a price, but anything that is so valuable as to not have a price has dignity. By this logic, anything that has dignity, or should be treated with dignity, cannot be given a price because it cannot or should not be bought and sold. And we see an example of this in Time 2.
How many of my years do you want?
There aren't enough years. Even in your lifetime, Mr. Weiss.
Because Raymond won't put a price on and exchange his moral code for time, he has dignity. Good for you, Raymond. And it's obvious why Philip is upset by this, because under his idea of capitalism, there should be nothing that cannot be bought and sold. It is simply a case of figuring out the right price.
There's nothing I cannot buy.
Because of this, scholars like Anderson think that there are certain things that should be treated with dignity and therefore cannot be reduced to monetary means. A human life is sacrosanct, and because all people should be treated with dignity, there cannot be a monetary exchange without the loss of that dignity. There's something special about a life and living that really shouldn't be brought down to basic means of money. And that's without even talking about the value of animal lives. But if you want to hear more about that, check out this episode I did on Planet of the Apes. Unfortunately, we live under a capitalist regime, which means that no intrinsic value is above a monetary exchange. Everything can be commodified because if you're rich enough, you can name any price. And if you're poor, then trading your dignity might be the difference between life and death. And we live in a social order where it literally costs money just to survive. In Time actually has another interesting thing set up. It comes up a few times, and it isn't the focus of any particular scene that it's in, but it's the way that people, and particularly children, can be exploited and capitalized. In the movie, we see that Will's best friend just had a child, but we also get some interesting comments about this child.
Shame we gotta wait 25 years. Could use that year right now.
And when Will talks about his clock starting at 25, he also makes some comments.
My year was gone in a week. We were so in debt. After that, I lived day to day.
On the other hand, Sylvia was the opposite.
My dad gave me a decade to celebrate.
Apart from the wealth disparity, which is pretty obvious, the movie is telling us about the nature of having a child in this economic climate. For wealthy people, like Philip and Sylvia, having a child is something that you can choose to do because you want to. But for poor people, having a child might become an economic boon for two reasons. The first is the most obvious. Having a child means you get a year of wealth for your family. Just out of nowhere, you would add a year of value, and for the people in Dayton, that is a lot. A whole year could make or break a family in that kind of situation. The only drawback is you would have to wait to get to the child to 25 years of age, which is a huge economic undertaking, which leads us to the second reason. 25 years just to get a year back probably is not economically viable, except for the fact that the child's clock doesn't start until they're 25, meaning that anyone under that age doesn't have to worry about their clock ticking down. Basically, as soon as a kid can start working, they likely bring in more value than they use up.
Come on, Will. I've got bills to pay.
Having a child does mean another mouth to feed, but if you're poor, it also means that everything after the first few years of life until the age of 25 could be used or exploited in order to gain time without having to worry about the child wasting it. This would probably cause a massive amount of child labor and a whole bunch of other issues around the suffering of life and labor, which you can hear me talk more about in this episode on Severance. This increase in having children for the sake of their exploitable time and the extra year might seem good to the lower class, but it would actually benefit the wealthy. They would now have more time to exploit out of more people. Capitalism measures success by growth, meaning the rich are always looking to get richer. The wealthy need to ensure that the lower class has enough so that they can be exploited for their time as currency or as labor. If the ruling class wants to control the lower class, then they need to make people believe there is a way to get ahead while ensuring the means of the ruling class's survival.
Why do you think taxes and prices go up the same day in the ghetto?
Throughout the film, Philip makes references to survival of the fittest.
This is merely Darwinian capitalism. Natural selection.
And capitalism has a lot in common with survival of the fittest, but the predator is not also responsible for maintaining the system in which it benefits. And as we've previously established, human life has no dignity. So the rich don't care if you time out because it would be like going broke in the real world. And if you're broke, you might as well be dead. You have no money and therefore cannot interact with society in a way that benefits the wealthy. Using time as currency forces people into working in order to live. There's no escaping capitalistic labor. There are no homeless people or those who live outside the market because they would just die. And even if they didn't die, people with no money, or time as the case may be, have no value on the market because they have nothing to exchange. So the loss of life no longer becomes an intrinsic loss, but an economic loss. In this kind of system, the only way to survive or get ahead would be to make sure that your time is seen as more valuable than others so that chunks of your life would actually be worthwhile in terms of economic means. Because in the world of In Time, and to some extent in the real world, your life is reducible to dollars and cents. This is an incredibly bleak take, but if there's one thing I keep saying, it's that the premise of this movie begs for deeper exploration. I've attempted to do that based on what we were shown, but I did have to make some rather large interpolations about how the world of In Time functions. However, I do think that the basic tenets of the arguments I made are already there in the movie. The idea of time as currency is not so far off the mark when we realize that we are paid for the time we work and that the time we give is a part of our limited life, meaning that we monetize our own lives on the market and reduce our intrinsic value. We remove our own dignity because we need money to survive, and the only way to do that is to spend time working. Rich people continue to get richer by exploiting the labor and time of poorer people, and this may lead to problems like child labor, which, by the way, we are seeing a return to in the United States. So that's a fun side note. I don't think it's morally okay to value one life over another, or even to put a monetary value on any life. But we do. We don't think we do, but we do. And like the characters in the movie, if I could take down the system, I would. Not that robbing a bank would actually make any difference, because the system ensures its own survival regardless of robbery. The point of this was just to look at some parallels between the movie and the reality of our economic system. And for a flashy action movie that on the surface is kind of shallow, I say it's got some pretty smart things to say. And that is why In Time has an amazing premise that really sheds some light on how we spend and value our time. Here are my stray thoughts. If you want to hear more about how we sell ourselves onto the market, check out this video I did on The Last of Us, or this whole playlist I have on Marxist discourse and capitalism. Although it wasn't really the focus of the story, I didn't really talk much about existential ennui, even though it did come up once and the whole idea of living forever, but maybe I'll do that for a future video. Despite the strange character writing, I actually think Amanda Seyfried and Olivia Wilde are both great at their craft and should have been given more to work with. Cillian Murphy is probably the best part of this movie, and I really would have liked more of a personal character arc for his character. I also found the exploration of daily life of both the rich and the poor more interesting than any of the action. This really would have benefited from being a long series TV show. So like, actually, call me. Hey, thanks so much for watching that episode. Sometimes it's fun to like watch a movie and read it in a way that it is not meant to be watched. So if you were like, I don't know where Janglez is getting any of these ideas, I absolutely understand. But if you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe so you'll never miss another episode of anything going on right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.